Welcome to today's deep dive into one of the most debated topics in sports performance: psychological skills training. I'm going to share what over 1,000 research studies actually tell us about mental training techniques like goal setting, imagery, and self talk. And here's the thing: the truth is more nuanced than what you'll hear from most sports psychology consultants or motivational speakers. The research shows that yes, these techniques work, but they don't work as dramatically as many claim, and the effects are significantly smaller when we look at the highest quality studies. Today, we're going to cut through the marketing and examine what the science really says about mental training in sports, including some uncomfortable truths about the field that rarely get discussed. Let me start with the headline finding. Across multiple meta analyses covering thousands of athletes, psychological skills training produces moderate improvements in performance. When researchers combine all the studies and calculate the average effect, they find what's called a moderate effect size, not huge, not tiny, but meaningful. To put this in perspective, if you took two equally matched athletes and gave one psychological skills training while the other continued regular training, the one with mental training would win about 65 to 70% of the time. That's a real advantage, but it's not the game changing transformation that's often promised. What's particularly interesting is what happens when researchers dig deeper into the quality of these studies. When they look only at randomized controlled trials, the gold standard of research, the effects get smaller. When they look only at studies using objective performance measures rather than self reported improvements, the effects shrink again. And when they remove studies with potential publication bias, where negative results might not have been published, the effects diminish further. This doesn't mean psychological skills training doesn't work, but it does mean we need to be realistic about what it can and can't do. So let's talk about what actually works, starting with the big three: goal setting, imagery, and self talk. These are the most studied techniques in sports psychology, with hundreds of research papers examining their effects. Each has solid evidence behind it, but each also has important nuances that often get overlooked in simplified presentations. Goal setting is probably the most consistently supported technique across all sports and levels. The research shows that setting specific, challenging goals improves performance more reliably than almost any other psychological intervention. But here's what often gets missed: the type of goal matters enormously. Process goals, focusing on technique or strategy, tend to work better than outcome goals focused on winning or placing. Self referenced goals comparing yourself to your own past performance work better than other referenced goals comparing yourself to competitors. And perhaps most importantly, goals need to be adjusted regularly based on progress and changing circumstances. The mechanism behind goal setting is relatively straightforward. Goals direct attention to relevant aspects of performance, they mobilize effort, they increase persistence, and they prompt the development of new strategies. When you set a specific goal to improve your serve percentage in tennis from 60 to 65%, you naturally pay more attention to your serving technique. You practice serves more deliberately, you persist through temporary setbacks, and you experiment with adjustments to reach that target. But here's where the research gets interesting and where many athletes and coaches go wrong. Goals that are too easy don't improve performance because they don't require effort or adaptation. Goals that are too hard can actually decrease performance by creating anxiety and undermining confidence. The sweet spot is what researchers call the zone of optimal challenge: difficult enough to require effort and growth, but not so difficult as to seem impossible. The research also reveals something crucial about goal setting that's often ignored: the importance of implementation intentions. It's not enough to set a goal. You need specific plans for when, where, and how you'll work toward it. Athletes who set goals but don't create implementation plans show much smaller improvements than those who do both. An implementation intention might be: when I arrive at practice, I will spend the first 10 minutes working on the specific technique drill my coach identified for improving my serve. This level of specificity dramatically increases the likelihood of follow through. Now let's examine imagery, also called visualization or mental rehearsal. The research here is robust but complex. Overall, imagery training produces moderate improvements in performance with effect sizes similar to goal setting. But the devil is in the details. Imagery works best when it's vivid, controllable, and includes multiple sensory modalities, not just visual, but also kinesthetic, auditory, and even emotional components. The most recent meta analysis, analyzing 86 studies with over 3,500 athletes, found some fascinating patterns. Imagery combined with other psychological skills training works better than imagery alone. The optimal dose appears to be about 10 minutes of practice, 3 times per week, for at least 100 days. Less than this, and you don't see much effect. More than this, and you hit diminishing returns. This is crucial information that's rarely communicated to athletes who might spend hours visualizing without seeing benefits, or give up after a week because they don't see immediate results. The type of imagery matters too. Cognitive specific imagery, where you rehearse specific skills or techniques, works best for skill development. Cognitive general imagery, where you rehearse strategies or game plans, helps with tactical performance. Motivational specific imagery, where you imagine achieving goals, boosts confidence. Motivational general imagery, where you imagine the feelings associated with competition, helps with anxiety management. Most athletes only use one or two types, missing out on the full range of benefits. What's particularly interesting about imagery research is how it challenges some common assumptions. For instance, many people believe that imagery works by creating muscle memory through micro movements. But studies using EMG to measure muscle activity during imagery show that while there is some activation, it's not enough to explain the performance improvements. Instead, imagery seems to work primarily through cognitive mechanisms, strengthening neural pathways, improving motor planning, and enhancing confidence. The research also reveals important individual differences in imagery ability. Some people naturally create vivid, controllable mental images, while others struggle to visualize at all. These differences are partly innate but can be developed with practice. Athletes who score low on imagery ability tests show smaller improvements from imagery training initially, but can develop this ability over time. This is rarely assessed or addressed in typical sports psychology interventions. Self talk, the third major psychological skill, has perhaps the most interesting research profile. The evidence shows that both instructional self talk, bend your knees, and motivational self talk, you can do this, improve performance, but they work best for different types of skills. Instructional self talk shows larger effects for precision skills requiring technique and form. Motivational self talk works better for strength and endurance tasks requiring effort and persistence. The mechanisms behind self talk are multifaceted. It can direct attention, regulate effort, trigger automatic movement patterns, and manage emotions. But recent research has revealed something surprising. The exact words might not matter as much as we thought. Studies comparing personalized self talk to standardized scripts find similar effects, suggesting that the act of deliberate self talk might be more important than the specific content. However, there's an important caveat that's often overlooked. Negative self talk doesn't always hurt performance as much as we might expect. Some athletes perform well despite, or perhaps even because of, harsh self criticism. The research suggests that the impact of negative self talk depends heavily on how the athlete interprets it. If they see it as motivating challenge, it might help. If they see it as threatening judgment, it hurts. This nuance is rarely captured in simplified, think positive advice. Now let's address mindfulness training, which has exploded in popularity in recent years. The research shows moderate positive effects on performance, particularly for managing anxiety and maintaining focus under pressure. But here's what's interesting. Mindfulness seems to work differently than traditional psychological skills training. Rather than trying to control thoughts and emotions, mindfulness involves accepting them without judgment and returning attention to the present moment. Meta-analyses of mindfulness interventions in sport show effect sizes around 0.67, which is meaningful but not massive. The effects are stronger for psychological outcomes like reduced anxiety and increased flow states than for direct performance measures. This suggests that mindfulness might work indirectly, creating psychological conditions that support performance rather than directly enhancing skills. The optimal delivery of mindfulness training remains unclear. Some studies use traditional meditation practices, others use sport specific mindfulness exercises, and still others integrate mindfulness into physical training. The research hasn't definitively shown which approach works best, and it likely depends on the sport, the athlete, and the specific performance demands. What about combining these techniques? This is where things get really interesting. Multimodal interventions that combine goal setting, imagery, self talk, and other techniques consistently show larger effects than single techniques. The most recent meta analysis found effect sizes of 0.83 for multimodal psychological skills training, compared to around 0.75 for imagery alone and 0.67 for mindfulness alone. But here's the crucial point that often gets missed: more isn't always better. There's an optimal level of complexity for each athlete. Throwing every psychological technique at an athlete can create cognitive overload and actually impair performance. The research suggests starting with one or two techniques, mastering them, then gradually adding others. This progressive approach shows better long term results than trying to implement everything at once. The timing of psychological skills training also matters enormously. Most studies examine interventions lasting 4 to 12 weeks, but the effects often don't appear until halfway through this period. Athletes who give up after a week or two of not seeing results are stopping just before the benefits would have appeared. This is a massive problem in real world application where athletes expect immediate results. Let's talk about some uncomfortable truths about the research quality in this field. A recent review of reviews found that 97% of systematic reviews in sports psychology were rated as low or critically low quality. This doesn't mean the findings are wrong, but it does mean we should be cautious about overstating the evidence. Common problems include small sample sizes, lack of control groups, subjective outcome measures, and selective reporting of positive results. When researchers conduct sensitivity analyses removing lower quality studies, the effects of psychological skills training often shrink by 30 to 50%. In some cases, effects that look significant in the overall analysis become non-significant when only high-quality studies are included. This is a sobering reminder that while psychological skills training works, it might not work as powerfully as the field sometimes claims. Publication bias is another significant issue. Studies showing positive effects are more likely to be published than those showing no effect. Statistical tests for publication bias in recent meta analyses suggest that the true effects of psychological skills training might be 20 to 30% smaller than what the published literature suggests. This doesn't negate the value of mental training, but it does mean we need realistic expectations. The issue of implementation fidelity is rarely discussed, but critically important. Most research studies ensure that psychological skills training is delivered consistently by trained professionals. But in real world settings, these techniques are often taught briefly, practiced inconsistently, and implemented without proper monitoring. It's no surprise that real world effects are often smaller than research effects. Let's examine how these techniques work differently across different sports and athletes. Endurance athletes seem to benefit more from certain psychological skills than power athletes. Studies in runners, cyclists, and swimmers show particularly strong effects for goal setting and motivational self talk. This makes sense given that endurance performance requires sustained effort and mental fortitude over extended periods. Team sport athletes face unique challenges that individual sport athletes don't. The research shows that psychological skills training in team sports needs to address not just individual performance, but also team cohesion, communication, and collective efficacy. Interventions that ignore the team dynamic often show smaller effects than those that address both individual and team factors. The research on elite versus recreational athletes reveals something counterintuitive. You might expect elite athletes to benefit more from psychological skills training since they're competing at the highest levels where mental factors matter most. But the research often shows larger effects for amateur and recreational athletes. This might be because elite athletes have already developed many psychological skills through their years of training, leaving less room for improvement. Age is another important factor that's often overlooked. Younger athletes, particularly adolescents, show different patterns of response to psychological skills training than adults. Their cognitive development, emotional regulation abilities, and motivational systems are still developing, which affects how they engage with and benefit from mental training. Interventions designed for adults often need significant modification to work with youth athletes. Cultural factors also play a role that's only beginning to be understood. Most psychological skills training research has been conducted in Western countries with individualistic cultures, but athletes from collectivistic cultures might respond differently to techniques emphasizing individual goals and personal achievement. Some research suggests that culturally adapted interventions show larger effects than generic programs. The integration of technology into psychological skills training is an emerging area with mixed results. Apps for goal setting, guided imagery, and mindfulness meditation are proliferating, but the research on their effectiveness is limited. Some studies show promise, particularly for improving adherence to mental training, but others find that technology delivered interventions are less effective than face to face delivery. Virtual reality is particularly interesting for imagery training. VR can provide immersive, controllable environments for mental rehearsal that might be more effective than traditional imagery. Early studies show promising results, but the technology is still too expensive and cumbersome for widespread use. As VR becomes more accessible, it could revolutionize how we approach mental training. Biofeedback and neurofeedback represent another technological frontier. These techniques allow athletes to see real time information about their physiological or neurological states and learn to control them. The research shows moderate effects, particularly for anxiety management and attention control, but the equipment is expensive, the training is time intensive, and it's unclear whether the benefits generalize beyond the laboratory. Let's address the elephant in the room, the placebo effect. Some critics argue that psychological skills training works primarily through placebo effects. Athletes improve because they believe the intervention will help, not because the techniques themselves are effective. The research suggests this is partially true, but not the whole story. Studies using active control groups where participants receive an alternative intervention they believe will help still show advantages for psychological skills training, suggesting effects beyond placebo. However, expectancy and belief do play important roles. Athletes who believe in psychological skills training show larger improvements than skeptics. This creates a challenge for researchers and practitioners. How do you maintain scientific skepticism while also fostering the belief necessary for interventions to work optimally? It's a delicate balance that's rarely discussed openly. The question of cost effectiveness is crucial but understudied. Psychological skills training requires time and often money. Is the 10 to 15% performance improvement worth the investment? For elite athletes where tiny margins matter, probably yes. For recreational athletes, it depends on their goals and resources, but these cost benefit calculations are rarely made explicit. What about negative effects? This is almost never discussed, but some athletes do experience negative outcomes from psychological skills training. Excessive focus on mental factors can create paralysis by analysis. Some athletes become so focused on their psychological state that they lose spontaneity and flow. Others develop anxiety about their anxiety, creating a negative spiral. These adverse effects are rarely measured or reported in research studies. The issue of individual responsiveness is fascinating and understudied. Just as some people are exercise responders who gain more fitness from the same training, some athletes seem to be psychological skills responders who benefit more from mental training. We don't yet understand what predicts responsiveness, but it likely involves personality factors, learning styles, and perhaps genetic differences in neuroplasticity. Long term effects remain largely unknown. Most studies follow athletes for weeks or months, not years. Do the benefits of psychological skills training persist? Do they require ongoing practice to maintain? Do athletes who learn these skills early in their careers show different developmental trajectories? These crucial questions remain largely unanswered. The transfer of psychological skills to life outside sport is often claimed but rarely studied. Proponents argue that goal setting, imagery, and self talk learned in sport transfer to academic, professional, and personal domains. This makes intuitive sense, but the empirical evidence is limited. The few studies that exist show mixed results, suggesting that transfer isn't automatic and might require deliberate practice. Let's talk about practical implementation. Based on the research, here's what actually works. Start with one technique, probably goal setting, since it has the most consistent effects. Spend at least 4 weeks developing proficiency before adding another technique. Practice psychological skills at least 3 times per week for 10 to 20 minutes. Don't expect immediate results. Benefits typically appear after 2 to 4 weeks of consistent practice. The sequencing matters too. The research suggests starting with goal setting to provide direction and motivation. Add imagery once goals are clear and stable. Introduce self talk to support the execution of skills rehearsed through imagery. Layer in mindfulness if anxiety or distraction are problems. This progressive approach shows better results than trying to implement everything simultaneously. The role of coaches in psychological skills training is crucial but complex. Coaches who integrate mental training into regular practice show better results than those who treat it as separate. But many coaches lack the knowledge or confidence to teach psychological skills effectively. The research suggests that coach education in sports psychology is essential but often inadequate. The debate about who should deliver psychological skills training is ongoing. Sports psychologists argue for specialized expertise. Coaches argue for integrated delivery. The research suggests that both can be effective, but consistency and quality matter more than credentials. A coach who consistently reinforces psychological skills might be more effective than a sports psychologist who visits occasionally. Let's examine what doesn't work, or at least what the evidence doesn't support. Hypnosis, despite its dramatic reputation, shows minimal effects in controlled studies. Subliminal training tapes don't work at all. Crystal healing, energy work, and other alternative approaches lack any scientific support. This doesn't mean they can't have placebo effects, but there's no evidence for specific mechanisms. Even some mainstream techniques lack strong support. Team building exercises, despite their popularity, show mixed effects on performance. Arousal regulation techniques like progressive muscle relaxation work for some athletes but not others. Pre performance routines, while widely used, show inconsistent effects in research studies. The key is matching techniques to individual needs rather than applying generic programs. The timing of psychological skills relative to competition is crucial but understudied. Should mental training intensify before major competitions or remain consistent? Should new techniques be introduced during the competitive season or only in the off season? The limited research suggests maintaining consistent practice year round with slight intensification before major events, but avoiding major changes close to competition. Environmental factors affecting psychological skills training are often overlooked. Training in quiet, controlled environments might not prepare athletes for the chaos of competition. The research suggests that psychological skills should be practiced in conditions that progressively approximate competitive environments. This might mean imagery training with crowd noise, goal setting under time pressure, or self-talk practice while fatigued. The interaction between psychological and physical training is complex and important. Mental fatigue from intensive psychological skills training can impair physical performance. Conversely, physical fatigue can reduce the quality of mental training. The research suggests separating intensive psychological and physical training by several hours when possible, or integrating light mental training into physical recovery periods. Personality factors moderate the effectiveness of different techniques. Extroverts might benefit more from motivational self talk and team based interventions. Introverts might prefer imagery and individual goal setting. Athletes high in neuroticism might need more emphasis on anxiety management. Those high in conscientiousness might naturally gravitate towards structured goal setting. Matching techniques to personality shows promise but needs more research. The role of autonomy in psychological skills training is crucial. Athletes who choose to engage in mental training show larger effects than those who are required to participate. This creates a challenge for coaches and teams. How do you encourage psychological skills training without making it mandatory and potentially reducing its effectiveness? The research suggests emphasizing education and choice rather than mandates. Developmental considerations are essential but often ignored. Young athletes need different approaches than adults. Their abstract thinking abilities, emotional regulation skills, and motivational systems are still developing. Psychological skills training for youth should be more concrete, more playful, and more integrated with physical skill development. The research shows that age appropriate interventions are more effective than scaled down adult programs. The maintenance of psychological skills is a major challenge. Like physical fitness, mental skills deteriorate without practice. But unlike physical training, where detraining is obvious, psychological skill decay is subtle. Athletes might not notice their imagery becoming less vivid or their self talk becoming less effective until performance suffers. Regular assessment and refresher training are essential, but rarely implemented. Cultural sports psychology is an emerging field with important implications. Different cultures have different relationships with mental training. What works in North American football might not work in Japanese judo. Concepts like individual achievement, mental toughness, and competitive drive are culturally constructed. Interventions that respect and incorporate cultural values show larger effects than generic Western programs. The gender dynamics of psychological skills training deserve attention. Research shows that female athletes often face different psychological challenges than males, including higher rates of anxiety, different motivational patterns, and unique pressures around body image. Yet, most psychological skills training programs are designed generically. Gender sensitive interventions show promise but remain underdeveloped. Let's talk about the future of psychological skills training. Personalized medicine is revolutionizing healthcare, and personalized psychology could do the same for sport. Instead of generic programs, athletes could receive interventions tailored to their psychological profiles, learning styles, and specific needs. This requires better assessment tools and more flexible intervention protocols, both of which are under development. Ecological momentary interventions delivered through smartphones at optimal times show promise for improving adherence and effectiveness. Instead of scheduled imagery sessions, athletes might receive prompts to practice brief imagery during natural breaks in their day. This approach could make psychological skills training more integrated and sustainable. The integration of psychological skills training with other performance support services is crucial but challenging. Nutrition, strength training, technical coaching, and mental training all compete for athletes' time and attention. The research suggests that integrated, holistic approaches work better than siloed services, but implementing integration requires significant coordination and communication. So, where does this leave us? Psychological skills training works, but not as dramatically as often claimed. Effect sizes of zero point 0.5 to zero point 0.8 represent meaningful improvements. that can make the difference between winning and losing at elite levels. But they're not transformative changes that turn average athletes into champions overnight. The key is realistic expectations and quality implementation. Athletes who commit to consistent, long term practice of evidence based techniques will likely see improvements in both performance and well being, but those expecting quick fixes or dramatic transformations will likely be disappointed. The field of sports psychology needs to be more honest about what psychological skills training can and cannot do. Overpromising leads to disappointment and skepticism. Understanding the real effects, which are moderate but meaningful, allows for appropriate investment and realistic expectations. For practitioners, the message is clear: quality matters more than quantity. A simple intervention implemented well is better than a complex program implemented poorly. Consistency matters more than intensity. 10 minutes 3 times a week for months is better than hour-long sessions that peter out after 2 weeks. For researchers, numerous questions remain. We need better understanding of individual differences, long-term effects, and optimal implementation strategies. We need more high-quality trials with objective outcomes and longer follow-ups. We need research on understudied populations and cultural adaptations. The evidence base for psychological skills training is solid but not spectacular. It's a useful tool in the performance toolkit, not a magic bullet. Athletes who approach mental training with realistic expectations, consistent practice, and quality implementation will likely benefit. Those seeking dramatic, rapid transformations should look elsewhere. As we wrap up this deep dive into the research, remember that science is always evolving. What we know today might be refined or even overturned tomorrow. The key is to stay informed, think critically, and base decisions on the best available evidence rather than hype or tradition. The mental side of sport is real and important. Psychological factors influence performance, and psychological skills can be developed. But like physical training, mental training requires consistent effort, quality instruction, and realistic expectations. There are no shortcuts, no magic techniques, and no substitutes for deliberate practice. Whether you're an athlete, coach, or sports psychology practitioner, I hope this honest examination of the research helps you make informed decisions about psychological skills training. The techniques work, but understanding their real effects, optimal implementation, and limitations is crucial for success. Mental training isn't about positive thinking or visualization magic. It's about developing specific cognitive and emotional skills through deliberate practice. When approached with scientific rigor and realistic expectations, psychological skills training can provide the marginal gains that separate good from great. But it's just one piece of the performance puzzle, not the whole picture. The future of sports psychology lies not in exaggerated claims or mystical techniques, but in honest, evidence based practice that acknowledges both the power and limitations of mental training. By understanding what the research really shows, we can move beyond hype toward genuine performance enhancement. This is Esther Adams with Strides to Solutions. Thank you for joining me for this deep dive into the science of psychological skills training. Remember, the mind matters in sport, but so does understanding what mental training can realistically achieve. Train smart, think critically, and always question claims that seem too good to be true. Because in sport, as in science, the truth is usually more complex but ultimately more useful than the hype.